they're not in one cohesive military base, but really all over the state, going back to places of employment. There's just this picture that appeared in the Lansing State Journal just a couple of weeks ago, in the last week, and this perhaps depicts some of the issues with veterans returning home, that the public is largely, in many cases, ignorant of what's going on with deployment. And as I said, only 1% is involved in the current war. So the slide just says, geez, what happened to you? You're in some kind of accident or something in Iraq. Is that still going on? Oh, yeah, well, got to run. So kind of just depicting possibly what it's like for some veterans returning home. I really want to emphasize that in Michigan, the National Guard and Reserves are our primary forces going out of the state of Michigan. And this is very important in that these service members are not stationed on military bases. They come back home and relatively quickly, within oftentimes weeks or months, return back to civilian life and civilian jobs. The reintegration support doesn't come from a military base where there's possibly dentists, mental health workers, etc., that are trained in their unique issues, but their support comes from their local communities, and some of these communities are unfamiliar with the military lifestyle. And then many of these service members are transitioning in and out of a military lifestyle, so some of them are undergoing multiple deployments, and certainly we have some concerns about the impact of multiple deployments. There was a recent task force developed by the Department of Defense that came out in 2007, and one of their primary recommendations was for much more services for National Guard forces across the country, and that was a very important recommendation. Because we work with families and couples, one of the things we're very interested in is issues for couples, and very few studies look at issues for couples and include family members in particular in their studies. So I think we believe our study is unique in this regard. But many challenges for couples, and I won't go through all of these, but new marital expectations, negotiating roles, getting to know each other again, developing new routines, dealing with extended family and friends. If there's a blended or step family, that always is a time of adjustment. All right, our collaboration began in 2006, and we really began with an outreach component, and we've been offering being part of family reunion workshops, marital enrichment retreats, offering clinical services at our campus clinic, and those kinds of things. But in 2007, we began a research study when we decided we wanted to learn more about the issues that not only returning veterans were facing, but also their families. So we collected data approximately 45 days after they returned home. So this is still pretty early. So these data, I must emphasize, are not long-term data, which would be very interesting to learn about as well. Our key areas of focus, and these are, if you look in the literature, if you look in the recent studies that are coming out, these are really key areas that are looked at. So these are things like depression, suicidality, post-traumatic stress disorder, vulnerability to post-traumatic stress disorder, what mental health barriers and utilization barriers exist. And then we also looked at relationships. What is the marital and relationship distress, and what is the parenting distress? I just want to, for those of you who may not know, just give a brief definition of some of these disorders. Post-traumatic disorder is a buzzword that's all over the media right now, and post-traumatic stress disorder is a cluster of symptoms that come after a traumatic event of some kind, and is commonly experienced as difficulties with sleeping, nightmares, jumpiness, numbness or dissociation, or intrusive thoughts. So, for example, if you're walking down an alley and you were beaten up, you may have flashbacks to that event. You may have nightmares about events. You may be sitting in a meeting like this and then reflect back to that event. So you may have trouble going to sleep or staying asleep because of that event. And then depression. I think all of us know what depression are, but that really is a depressed mood, a loss of interest in activities, a loss of interest in pleasure, having difficulties eating or sleeping, either eating too much or sleeping too much, or eating too little or sleeping too little, low energy, suicidal thoughts, those kinds of things. So just in our sample, our current sample, we have 285 service members and their spouses or significant others. And I'm not going to go through all of these. You can refer back to the PowerPoint for the details on these demographics. But Most of these in our study are parents of children. About 22% are step-parents. Interestingly, 10% of our sample has a special needs child of some kind. Pretty well balanced between male and female. 2/3 approximately are married. And the age range is from 22 to about 50 years old. That's the majority of our specific sample. So here's some of the findings that we're finding, and I want to emphasize that our findings really mirror others' findings of national studies. So firstly, when you look at depression, approximately 15% of service members have moderate to severe depression, and approximately 13% of the spouses or significant others in the sample have moderate to severe depression. Again, we find it quite interesting that as we look at the spouses or significant others, that they're struggling just as much as the service members are struggling in these cases. So we want to emphasize that, and there's just a graph that illustrates that, and hopefully you can see that this is the moderate to severe range, this is the severe range over here. So there is a proportion of our sample, again approximately 15%, that fall into that range. Something else that's been in the media a lot lately is suicide. Suicide amongst returning veterans, and unfortunately that is something that is a reality and is occurring, and certainly we're very interested and worried about service members who may fall through the cracks, who may not be noticed. And when you have suicidal thoughts, there's some people who reach out for help, but there's certainly some people who don't ask for help and are often successful in their suicide attempt. So this is just a suicide risk assessment that we did, and approximately 7% of service members and about 9% of their spouses or significant others have some suicidal risk. And again, I think what makes our study unique is that we do include spouses or significant others. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is our assessment was of service members related to a military event, and I don't want to get too technical here, but one of the ways you assess PTSD is in relation to a trauma. So we need to ask about a trauma. So in relation to a military trauma of some kind, this could be an explosion, a near-death experience, being wounded, something like that. 16% of our soldiers met criteria for PTSD. Again, this is very comparable to other studies of PTSD. We also looked at a non-military event. So this may be a soldier who entered the military who had been beaten up or held up at gunpoint prior to a military event. And about 14% of these soldiers met criteria in relation to a non-military event. In terms of spouses, this was maybe the most surprising part of our studies. We asked spouses in relation to a traumatic event in their lives if they had PTSD symptoms. And these would be events such as being sexually abused, being raped, being a victim of domestic violence, or those kind of things. And 22% of the spouses in our sample met criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder as well. And we want to emphasize that there are very limited services for spouses and family members that are offered. Something else we looked at was soldier vulnerability to the development of PTSD. And this would be someone who didn't meet a diagnosable criteria, but who had a lot of elevated symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, this is something that worries us a lot, is that 52% in our sample had some vulnerability to the development of PTSD. We need to emphasize that PTSD has an incubation period, and that it's not always evident directly after the event. Sometimes it may take months or even years before it develops into a full-blown disorder. So these vulnerability we define as having several elevated scores on the PTSD scale. And so this would be someone who was having trouble all the time sleeping, or who was hypervigilant all the time, something like that. Something else we looked at was marital or relationship distress. And I think it's obvious, but I want to emphasize the point that coming home to a distressful relationship would not be easy to do. I think it would just exacerbate existing stresses. And in our sample, again, about 40